everybody. This is, I think, the seventh appointment of our series about exile and creativity. And I just want to explain the reason of the choice of the topic of tonight, the two Amelia Rosselli. Some months ago, I described this series to a friend of mine and a professor at Columbia University, Nadia Urbinati. And Nadia Urbinati told me, okay, it's a beautiful series, but all men in this series. Why you don't have any women? And I said, it's true, you have some suggestion. And she said, yes, my suggestion is Amelia Rosselli. And I thought of Amelia Rosselli, the poet. And so I told with Alessandro Cassin of Centro Primo Levi, who organized with us this series. And I said, I spoke with Nadia Urbinati, and he suggested the name of Amelia Rosselli, and also to invite Marina Calloni to speak about it. And I know the poet, and Alessandro said to me, no, it's wrong, Amelia Rosselli, because we are speaking about Amelia Rosselli, the grandmother of the poet, who took over the family after the killing of her two sons, Carlo and Nello Rosselli, in France, killed by the fascists, and took all the family, formed at this point by women and children, and come to the United States. And Amelia Rosselli was also a playwright and an anti-Fascist and a friend of Gaetano Salvemini and so on. But, said Alessandro, also Amelia Rosselli is related to the topic of the series, because he was there with all the family, and this sense of exile, of sradicamento, lack of roots, remain in his poetry, in her poetry for all her life. And so it's also Amelia Rosselli could be a name. And so I tell, okay, we could speak about the both. And so here we are. We could speak about both Amelia Rosselli. Marina Calloni will speak about the grandmother. Marina Calloni is professor of political and social philosophy at Department of Sociology and Social Research at University of Milan Bicocca. And Jennifer Scapettone will speak about Amelia Rosselli, the granddaughter. Jennifer Scapettone is Associate Professor, Department of English, Language and Literature at the University of Chicago, and she's also a poet herself. So please enjoy.
So starting from the topic of the series, Exile and Creativity, what I would like to emphasize is the crucial role that New York, with Boston, Cambridge, played not only as a city that hosts Italian political anti-fascists and Jewish refugees between the 20s and the 40s, but as a place that contributed to make possible a different intellectual and political vision for a democratic Italy, and not only. For this reason, my presentation will be mainly focused on Amelia Rosselli, born Pincherle, Moravia. She was the aunt of Alberto Moravia, mother of Carlo and Nello, who were killed in France in 1937 by the Cogulards on the behalf of Mussolini and Ciano's entourage. And she was anonymous grandmother of Amelia, familiarly called Melina. And I would like to focus my presentation on the power of imagination and action in exile shown by Amelia Rosselli, Sr. Amelia Rosselli is a paradigmatic figure in the Italian culture, also underestimated until recent years. Namely, Amelia showed to be politically and intellectually able to be creative while she was in exile, imagining and acting for a free, democratic, and republican Italy. As I will try to argue later, she was capable to transform her heart as a writer into anti-fascist practices on the basis of moral principle she believed in, that is, freedom and justice. At the end of the 19th century and after the spread of fascism, Amelia Rosselli was in fact the premier Italian woman writer for the theater, very renewed. During the years she spent in exile, she committed herself not only to keep vivid the remembrance, the memory of her sons, publishing their work, thanks also to Salvemini's help, but also she engaged herself in the battle against Nazi fascism, becoming one of the most influential figures in the Italian diaspora. So I will start with searching on Amelia through. Before introducing Amelia's power of imagination in exile, I would like to underline how my interest in Amelia started, because it was precisely in New York in 1995. My colleague Lorella Cedioni, who tragically passed away, asked me to join her in a research focus on Guglielmo Ferrero and Gina Lombroso, who went into exile in Geneva in 1930, and they died also there. And she asked me to work with her at the archives of the Columbia University. To our great surprise, we noticed that many letters of the Rossellis to Ferrero family were not yet published. In particular, some letters written by Amelia Rosselli seemed to me to be very interesting, so I wanted to know more. Ferrero Lombroso heirs gave me the access to their private archive, which was based in Tuscany, in the Chianti area, and I found that there are many letters which were not given to Columbia because they thought that they were considered too much private, and mainly feminine. So what feminine means? So then we published this book with Lorella, this book that on the letters. This fact pushed me to try to find more about Amelia, who was only known as the painful mother of the two killed heroes, of the two brothers. Yet some references in books on Carlo referred to a memoir of her never published. I wanted to know more. With great generosity, the Rosselli heirs gave me not only the opportunity to read the memoir, rejected by several published because considered too feminine, too female, like a memory of a grandmother, but also gave me the possibility to consult the entire archive of the family, preserved at the Villa La Parita next Florence. Now the archive, also thanks to Alessandro Cassin, is safe at the archive, National Archive in Florence. Amelia Rosselli needed for justice, I thought, as writer and public intellectual, because she was neglected over decades. So the first thing I did, do you know what was to distinguish in library's catalog Amelia Rosselli, born Pincherle, Moravia, from her granddaughter Amelia. In fact, they were mentioned as they would have been the same person, who was a very long-lived and prolific writer, author of poetries, novels, comedies, dramas, tirelessly from 1898, when Amelia published her first drama, to 1996, when Melina died. So I say, no, they are different persons. With the publication The Memorie, in 2001, Amelia I edited, Amelia Rosselli Sr. was detracted from oblivion and recognized as an important figure not only in Italian culture, but at the international level, and is the reason why we published a book on Jewish intellectual women in Central Europe by a publisher in New York, and the cover is Amelia Rosselli. So this take me to the second point of my presentation, that is that post-war culture and politics has forgotten the work performed by influential anti-fascist women of Jewish origins in exile. And this was my research. I tried to give justice to these women. So why did she struggle against tyranny? Amelia's imagination for a democratic country in peace and her struggle against any political domination was inspired by her ancestors, who experienced political exile in the 19th century in France, Switzerland, England, which happened to her too, because they were opponents against a double form of subjection, as Jews and as subjects of foreigner domination. It is the case of both from the side of Amelia Pincherle Capone family and Rosselli Natal family, who helped Mazzini in London, and whose interconnection exemplifies the history of different Jewish groups, that is, Romagnots, Ashkenazis, and Sephardics. Amelia Rosselli Pincherle Moravia was born in Venice, as I said, in 1870. In 1892, she married Giuseppe Emanuele Rosselli, called Joe, whose mother was Harriet Nathan, who was born of British origin, and she was also the sister of Nathan. Filippo Nathan was a major of Rome in 99, from whom Amelia separated in 1902 because she said Joe had negative qualities. She had 3 children, Aldo, Carlo, and Nello, who were all killed for the ideals of justice and freedom and the love of country. The voluntary exile of Amelia, third point of my presentation. Aldo was killed during World War I, Carlo and Nello during fascism. After the murders of Carlo and Nello and their funeral held in Paris on 19 June 1937, Amelia decided to go into a voluntary exile. She left Italy, promising to return only after the country's liberation from the fascist dictatorship. She remained in exile for 9 years, from 1937 to 1946. Amelia chose exile as an anti-fascist and was not motivated by anti-Semitic persecution because the racial laws were signed in Italy 1 year later, that is in 1938. And we had a lot of work on that in Italy. After Paris, Amelia's temporary refuge from 1937 to 1939 was Villars-sur-Olon in Switzerland. When the Swiss government refused to give a visa for the 4 children, Nello's children, the family moved to England and lived in Eastbourne and in Quentin Brooks from 1939 to 1940. The danger of Nazi occupation of Great Britain convinced Amelia, with her 2 sons' widows, Marion and Maria. Marion was until that time between, not with them, was in Paris, in France mainly, and 7 grandchildren, John, Amelia, Andrea, Carlo's children, plus Silvia, Paolo, Aldo, Alberto, Nello's children. These children were all between the ages of 3 and 13, to sail to the United States. Amelia remained always firmly attached to her moral imperative, to struggle against any form of tyranny, to remember the sacrifice of her sons, to devote all her energies to the return of a free and democratic country. Creativity and imagination combined each other in the idea of a different future for younger generations. So, what was a moral and political commitment in daily life by Amelia when she was here in New York, in Larchmont, in exile? The arrival to the US was not easy at all because of the danger to be bombarded by Nazi ships and because Rosselli as Italian were considered enemy aliens. Yet anti-fascist friends who already lived in New York helped them. Among them was mainly Max Ascoli, whose fiancée, Marion Rosenfeld, interceded on the Rosselli behalf with Eleanor Roosevelt. Amelia's family obtained the visa necessary to remain in the United States because they were 7-10 people. And from 1940 to 1946, they lived in Larchmont next to New York. In the United States, Amelia became a moral, intellectual, and political model for the diaspora, anti-fascist community, as well as a confidant for younger refugees. In a commemoration, Tullia Zevi, who in 1983 became the first woman president of the Union of Italian Jewish Communities, called Amelia a great matriarch. With that, Zevi did not mean a central female figure who is the founder of a family group. She meant, I quote, an authoritative inspirer who communicated and transmitted values among generations, translated the sacredness into daily life. Therefore, Amelia was a woman of worth, as pictured in the book of the Proverbs. As I remember where they said, she speaks with wisdom and dignity, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. From the Proverbs. Amelia's faculty from translating sacredness to daily life is a crucial point. Here, sacredness does not necessarily coincide with religion or reason, but refers to a specific secular ethics that is an interior daily praxis of moral principles. Amelia found a peaceful compatibility between Ebraismo e Italianità, Judaism and Italianness, as her son argued during the Congress of Young Jewish in 1924. The compatibility between moral principles of Jewish origin and democratic political values of freedom and justice lies at the basis of Amelia's patriotism, which finds its origins in particular in the context of the constitution of Italianness as a common national identity, but which had to be inclusive of the otherness. So what Amelia did learn when she was here in Larchmont in the US, despite family commitments, and so she was over 70, Amelia continued to learn from the new American reality and to be politically engaged, mainly in the women's division of the Mazzini Society she contributed to establish, which kept the Mazzini Society in contact with partisans in Italy and brought aid to the suffering Italian population. She also started, Amelia, to collaborate with the weekly magazine La Settimana dei Ragazzi, founded by her friend Laura Orvieto after the liberation of Florence in 1944. Amelia thus became an epistolary writer mainly for two reasons. First, to stay in contact with friends forced into diaspora for political and racial reasons, and to maintain the vivid memory of her sons by publishing their works and gathering materials on their lives. But she was a ghostwriter. Why? Because in the archive, working in archives, I discovered that many writers, also Salvemini, published the notes integrally by Amelia without mentioning the author, but putting their name, and was also the case of some other historians who were working on the biography of Carlo Rosselli. So politics, ethics, and women's questions remain at the core of Amelia reflection and actions, creativity, and imagination in exile. So coming to the end of my presentation, I would say what she learned also from the American reality, mainly in terms of women's movement. In an article she wrote in 1945, shortly after the end of World War II, while she was still living in the United States, Amelia wrote, "It's sad and discouraging to conclude a long life, one too long, seeing the rise of the same unsolved problems that plagued our minds, our hearts, when we were young. We still see displayed in the impending renewed struggle the old banners, female emancipation, women question, and so on. Our men, also the most enlightened, did not want ever to hear that. In Italy, every demonstration or attempt or for a collective women's demonstration were ridiculed. Perhaps our error, and it's very self-reflexive, our mistake was that we limited the fight to a restricted circle. So it's an anti-elitist criticism because she was very much engaged in women's issue. This was due to the fear of facing public opinion and seeming ridiculous. In the end, it was due to the fact that we did not organize the masses, giving the movement too intellectual a character. Yet, until the masses fight in order to gain essential liberties, we cannot hope to reach them. The conquest of these liberties can, of course, be pursued by the few, but they have to be gained by many. It means that the Italian women should take on a wider circle of duties and responsibilities for which, up until now, she has been extraneous. March 1946. Italian women gained for the first time the right to vote in local elections. A few months later, on June 2nd, they participated in the popular referendum that decided for the republican system in place of the Italian monarchy, which had permitted the fascist dictatorship for 20 years and the anti-Semitic laws. Amelia's hope was fulfilled. Justice was done, but at the price of the sacrifice of her sons and millions of victims. Amelia returned to Italy with her extended family on June 30th, 1946, after 9 years in exile. She was able to see again her beloved house, situated in Via Giusti in Florence 83, a site devastated in 1925 by the fury of a fascist squad, but preserved from the wartime bombardment and maintaining intact thanks to the care of neighborhood nuns. In Florence, although octogenarian, Amelia continued to participate in debates on post-fascist Italy and the difficult transition to democracy. Amelia lived her final days in the house that she loved for itself and for the memories it evoked, as a place where she had lived with her sons. She died on 24th December 1954 in the presence of her relatives. Justice was possible on this earth. Imagination became reality. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you all for coming out on such a cold evening. I too would like to thank Giorgio Van Straten, Barbara Dalfovo, Alessandro Cassin, Maria Carloni for her presentation, and everyone who helped envision and carry out this event, which I'm grateful for on multiple counts. It gives us the chance to celebrate two radical writers and activists whose social and aesthetic contributions to 20th century culture have been overshadowed by the illustrious men in their lives. By resituating the work of these women in relation to one another, we're able to continue piecing together the mosaic of an exceptionally committed family's affective, artistic, and political counter-proposals to tyranny over several generations of conflict. I'm here to talk today about the younger Amelia, whose life you will now understand as profoundly influenced by the motion engendered by her father Carlo and Uncle Nello's activism and assassination by fascist terrorists in Normandy. Their movements between France, Switzerland, England, Italy, and the United States, upstate New York and Westchester County, where this photo was taken, locus of the family's shelter with the intervention of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, the Mazzini Society, and Max Ascoli of the New School for Social Research. I'm here primarily to highlight the value of one of the lasting monuments to this experience, a prismatic, polyglot poetry of resistance that challenges us with truculence to continue seeking and redefining the language that is the shape and sound of belonging. disciplinary rigidity, truisms about poetry's aloofness from collective life, and the seeming anomalousness of Rosselli's poetic voice from its content to her very tone have led to the fact that the verse of Amelia, or Melina, as she was known by the family to distinguish her from her grandmother, is often siloed away from discussions of the family's political influence. But as someone who believes in the social value of language work, its ability to move us through social ills and routes beyond that exceed the pragmatic strictures of policy and political programs, I consider this an opportunity gravely missed. The career of the younger Amelia, and just to distinguish, whenever I say Amelia, I now mean Melina, the younger Amelia, or I will say her grandmother. It deviates from that of her more liberal and patriotic elders in expressing a jarring suspicion surrounding projects of nation building. In this quote from an unpublished letter to her brother, the 22-year-old is tormented by the question of political action. She refuses to compromise the hopes of tomorrow, and her longings fail to coalesce in a single vision, like that of Carlo Rosselli's liberal socialism. Yet that hesitancy doesn't mean that she would withdraw into the private spheres of confession typical of mid to late 20th century poetry. She explicitly rejected such a withdrawal, expressing a paradoxical and perhaps impossible wish to compose an objective poetry where the I is the public. In place of the nation, the tormented I of Rosselli forges solidarity with communities of different scales, from the regional, that of the canton in minoritarian folk cultures of the global South, to the transnational, as she imagined each poem as a total environment hosting polyphony, or to be more precise, polyrhythm. In 1944, the renegade linguist Frederick Bodmer proposed in this volume from Rosselli's personal library that the constructive task of devising an auxiliary medium to supplement existing national languages is one of the foremost needs of our time, a prerequisite to keeping the world's peace. And the book that followed shows one how to speak many languages, and it's really moving to see these lessons that Amelia Rosselli took by herself as an autodidact to learn as many languages as possible. In one of that book's epigraphs from H.G. Wells, Wells accuses historians of glossing over how imposition of a language or a blending of languages gives a new twist and often a new power to the community's mental processes. Yet while poets working across or beyond languages may aspire to universal understanding in a Pentecostal key, the language they forge almost often emerges as cryptic, even illegible, poised at the threshold of the unintelligible. It's particularly valuable to reread this poetry now, for reimagining the contours of so-called national languages and the possibility of shoring up a collective from the tenuous threshold of citizenship and respingimento, sending ships back, from the point of view of a refugee, is a crucial task in a moment in which, according to the UN Refugee Agency, forced displacement is at a record 68.5 million lives annually. A 3-word poem from Variazioni Belliche, or bellicose variations, portends what a battle this can be, and accounts for its authors being perpetually misunderstood or underestimated. Cercatemi e fuoriuscite, the poem as terse command that, by situating us on a grammatical tightrope between transitive and intransitive states, activity and passivity, places us being hailed in a paradoxical state of banishing at large, without any named object, and of being exiled. essere fuoriusciti, to be exiled, is not an action one can be commanded to realize as a free agent. And as such, this poem feels unfinished, aslant, agrammatical, or off-tune, to use a term that editor Elio Vittorini deployed to try getting Amelia to correct moments like these. The destination of the exiling action is illocatable, to use a term Rosselli forged when translating Emily Dickinson. Its location is illocality, says Emily Dickinson of Affliction. So Amelia brought that word, which doesn't really exist in English, into the Italian language. Locus, place, hails the poet attuned to sonic kinship whose experimentation takes place in locution or speech. Here we have an illocution, a three-word poem as speech act, which itself achieves the order of placing us at sea, ill at ease, discomfortably between states of mind and citizenship. The voice of Rosselli itself places us between loci. The poem as read, or ideally as heard, in the very voice of spaesamento, displacement, characteristic of her recitations, attunes us immediately to sound, the lights out. The best way of relating what I mean is to play this poem from her English language collection, Sleep, which has an Italian title actually, meaning lighthouse.
Be kind, be kind, be kind, I hear this phrase screaming in my ear each day. Be sweet, be sweet, be sweet, be sweet, this is all I can say, or seem to say. Alas, the phrase, the flare, the open door, the glare, the blare, the fan, the flight, the high tower, reaching up towards glaze, are all I am fit to say, to see, to hear, to feel, to sway. And the open door fitted into a present day. Most say, most say, most say, most die on this cross. The watchtower, the barrel hill, the lights go out upon the swing of the hill. It's a plague, and oh bemoan the day, the clay, the meat on your fingers. So that's what they're for, the lighthouse watching anxiously far.
The peculiar poetic logic of kinship, of kind, haunts the kindness we are at first inclined to read in this poem, as kinship is in line with the arbitrary classifications of rhyme. Amidst the hammering off rhymes of iams, semantic association skids, though the whole tends toward an improvised coherence through images of stupefaction. The sentence or phrase slides into visual flare, glare, glaze, and into sonic blare. The message in saying caves to the carnal senses of language's transmission, seeing, hearing, feeling, and finally swaying, which displaces saying, are overloaded, fraught in the etymological sense, as with a ship's cargo. The final couplet's promise of illumination instead delivers utter disorientation. The lighthouse hovers at the poem's close, an anxious onlooker rather than a true faro, watching or piloting core. The image of the lighthouse or lantern appears constantly in her poetry as an inoperative figure for navigation. In this poem, land itself barrels, sways, and we get a sense of a person who considers herself, as she wrote to John in 1956, a wild bussola, or a compass gone awry. An early poem from her English series, October Elizabethans, imagines the subjecthood of its protagonist as threefold, with each soul a fish scattered overseas. Oh, were I one in three, just like the Holy Ghost, the Father and the Son, I'd reunite my scattered souls and string them in from all the seas abroad. we know why it was difficult for Rosselli, as neither father nor son, but as daughter, to fuse, to fish integrity out of the would-be linguistic trinity of her experience. As a subject nata a Parigi, born in Paris, giaciuta in America, laid in America, and vissuta in Italia, paese barbaro, as a child of the Second World War, Rosselli lacks a mother tongue. She represents Italy, the only nation-state truly lived in a rare moment of autobiography, as the barbarous country. As she exceeds the provincial limits of national ideologies, she simultaneously taps the barbarism of writing lyric from a non-dominant cultural perspective. And along with this fragment, I've put up the definition of vissuta, because it reveals the inherent sexism of concepts of experience rendered feminine. An experienced woman, like the more malicious phrase, una donna navigata, a navigated woman, is one who has had many sexual experiences. In rotta con l'arcipelago fummo travolti dal fiume, in organica vicenda, terra e mare sputavano sangue invece. And then, tu lanterna che credevi guidare, io manovella rotta. The liquid landscape of this politically haunted lyric from Serie Ospedaliera, or Hospital Series, agitates a first-person plural that's en route with the archipelago, swept up by the torrent between islands of terrain. A hybrid territory of land and sea spits blood instead of water, confusing potential metaphors of blood and soil citizenship in an overall landscape of censure. The speaking subject's mind mirrors this environment, cast as an archipelago disperata di tanto vuoto, desperate of so much void between touchstones. The you that would normally anchor the lyric subject is cast as another inoperative lantern, the I a broken rudder. Yet there is something to be reclaimed in an exile, in a landscape of exile as well, a liberatory capacity tapped through the tackings of poetry towed out from under oppressive, settled sentences. Assures the great servility, mobile on its two-legged carts. Rosselli's discomfiting occupation of the English language in sleep, while producing a state of queasiness in the native receiver, also hails a possible release from bondage, a perspective that casts the cart on shore in this poem as a figure of servile mobility, equipped with bungling legs instead of wheels, and inviting comparison with swifter conveyances over the water. At sea. For a refugee like Rosselli, as for one of her prominent leftist precursors to America, the emigrated poet, translator, labor activist, and wobbly Arturo Giovannitti, the sea can be a space of liberation, refuting servile obedience to land and country. This watery site of passage can be imagined as a wall-less medium of solidarity where siam tutti fratelli, we're all brothers, a medium that leads Giovannitti to recast the very notion of paese, or country. He imagines how just it would be if libera fosse la terra e ogni paese una nave, the land were free and every country a ship. What would it mean to see the earth as free to all, like the dream of the open sea, and to regard each nation as a mobile ship? Such proposals by the world's unacknowledged legislators could prove prescient. An archipelagic perspective would inspire the Venetian geophilosopher Massimo Cacciari at the moment of the European Union's idealistic theorization, eschewing centralized nationalist perspectives for conceptions of union through transit among islands. It would hearken back to the pre-modern representations contained in the Isolario genre, or the Venetian books of islands, which, as Theodore Casci argues, endured alongside and in counterpoint to the development of modern colonial space before its Mediterranean perspective was eclipsed, accounting for this genre's renewed interest for contemporary thinkers seeking to understand the interplay of local, regional, and global interactions, representations, and identities. In introducing Rosselli's poetry to the public in 1963, Pierpaolo Pasolini confronted the problematic of boundlessness triggered by Amelia's first book of poems through deployment of a more modern metaphor for deterritorialization or overseasness, that of the mushroom cloud. Il revival avanguardistico ha trovato in questa specie di Appolide dalle grandi tradizioni familiari di Cosmopolis un terreno dove esplodere con la funesta e meravigliosa fecondità dei funghi atomici. And I left the English there for you to read. Rosselli corrected his terminology years later. I am not a stateless person. I have an Italian father, and if I was born in Paris, it is simply because he had fled. The designation cosmopolitan goes back to Pasolini, but I reject that epithet for us. We are children of the Second World War. We were not cosmopolitans. We were refugees. The work that results demands comprehension of what it means to be a poet of disintegrated cantons, one who never possessed a mother tongue, but was possessed of a language fused and fragmented, itself a child of the Second World War, an artist who dismisses the prestige of cosmopolitanism with its implications of entitlement for the term refugee. This tortuous upbringing comes through poignantly in Rosselli's language, whether composing in the French, English, or Italian linguistic cantons of her life. And canton, I'm playing with this term that she uses in a poem of hers. She's playing on canto, song, or canto, a lyrical movement, but also on the jurisdictional subdivision of a nation, of a region, as in the cantons of Switzerland, for instance. Rosselli embraced Italy for reasons of affection, paternal and otherwise, and the language in which her grandmother recited classics to the children, such as Dante, nightly. She ultimately chose to compose the majority of her poetry in a defamiliarizing Italian that traffics in the grammars, lexical associations, and sound systems of dialects living and dead, English and French, dis- and reintegrating cantos, cantons. A note on Amelia Rosselli opens by comparing Rosselli's linguistically inventive idiom to una emulsione che prende forma per suo conto, imposseduta, come si ha l'impressione che succeda per gli esperimenti di laboratorio più terribili, tumori, scoppi atomici. Rosselli's poetry cultivates an explosive relation to limits, not only in linguistic and aesthetic senses, but in geopolitical and socio-historical terms as well. However, such linguistic fissions take place within an explicitly closed poetic, whose development was outlined in a poetic tractate called Spazi metrici, metrical spaces, invoked by this cover of her second book. Rosselli imposed regular line lengths on her verse in order to create what she called cube forms. As if improvising at the piano, she composed within forms that were roughly square at the typewriter, an instrument that enabled the production of lucid monospaced lines to signal the metric rule behind their composition. The poetic chambers produced within a squared or cube form were designed to house the ideal of an objective, total language. If my sonorous, logical, and associative experience is that of all peoples, then this shared experience can be captured in translinguistic fashion, even when writing in only one language, by permitting the prosody, the meter of all languages, all possible rhythms to fill one poetic square. Earlier letters to her brother John express an impatience with the rationalization of language, and she describes herself as looking around for body types of expression. A remarkable early lyric offers insight into her process of developing an embodied poetic solution. It invokes the medium of ravished mystical poetry, which Rosselli also took up when performing with David Tudor and Merce Cunningham at the Teatro Sistina in 1960 by breaking into a Gregorian chant. So I'm going to focus on these little moments. Gesù nelle membra totali combina la rima nuova, io prego illuminare I quattro mondi. There are no spaces, so there's this sense that everything needs to be regular. Inferno immobile sintetizza cantoni disintegrati della mia vita. The Christ presence that renders the speaker's conceptually dismembered limbs entire is entreated here to forge a new rhyme that will also syncretize cantons, both jurisdictional and poetic. The literally disintegrated cantons of this poem mark as disintegral the cultural and linguistic subdivisions of the four nations in the speaker's life, as well as the four corners that, once imposed on language and sound, form cantos or songs. This displaced speaker of Chiesa recalls the hell that synthesized the Italian vernacular, the Inferno of Dante, its magisterial architecture of cantos rationalizing the ethical and intellectual sphere of a poet in exile, to synthesize these cantons again. But Rosselli's own efforts of linguistic and architectonic synthesis will ultimately rupture and recombine from within rather than consolidating the Italian national language. They will stage the ecstatic and violent disintegration of cantons. Pasolini's nuclear metaphor expresses a truth to the experience of reading Rosselli's poetry that evades every painstaking analysis of her measured poetic system. For her, however cultivated and strategic her new geometrism of verse may be, it ultimately bespeaks the anxiety of the atomic age. Atomic blasts transgress the immediate European landscape of fascism with which Rosselli's work has necessarily come to be associated, addressing the outlandish phenomena of a world become violently one. The geographical alterity of the mushroom cloud, which immediately invokes the United States or Japan rather than the war-torn landscape of fascist Italy, mirrors the ambiguous nationality of this seemingly stateless person. In a later poem, Rosselli identifies with a feminized Pacific metaphor at the apex of this conflict, placing herself undecidedly between victim and aggressor. Nella Pearl Harbor che sono io esprimersi mai ebbe a miglior sorte altro che vanagloriosa espulsione dei resti. In the Pearl Harbor that I am, self-expression never had a better fate than vainglorious expulsion of remains. The Rosselli family's expulsed geography is extraordinary, but more exemplary, more emblematic of the global future than most readers would have projected or hoped. It is the outcome of political and psychic trauma, which found its tragic end in a suicide, eerily foreshadowed by Amelia Pincherle's 1906 play, L'idea fissa, or The Fixed Idea, in which a protagonist with a dual personality commits suicide by throwing himself from a window. I don't normally foreground Rosselli's disability, paranoid schizophrenia, and an obsession with the CIA, or her suicide, but am drawn to do so in this dark political moment in which visions of a southern border wall have prompted the longest shutdown of the US government in history, while on the shores of the Mediterranean, the far-right interior minister continues to resist accepting rescue ships for refugees, despite the EU's intervention. The status of perpetual outsider plagued Rosselli throughout her life. We can see her grappling on an intimate scale, spending her last lire in the 1950s on pronunciation lessons for R's that struck her would-be fellow citizens as too French or too English, or in her formal bid for double nationality in the country of her father, Italy, as well as of her mother, England. Not a word of this to nonna, she pleads to her brother in this letter, as the adults exchanged anxious notes about her difficulty in adapting to new contexts. She was only 7 when her father was killed. Her welfare as a young woman in Italy, her unpragmatic passion for her estranged grandfather Joe's realm of musical rages. Her work's belligerent alterity continues to plague its reception. I've argued with timorous editors for the exceptional relevance of Rosselli from a global perspective, noting her importance for emerging 21st century Italian poets and an older generation of renowned American authors. John Ashbery, the first to publish Rosselli's English poetry outside of Italy. Jerome Rothenberg, founder of the ethnopoetics movement, and Jackson McClough, renowned experimentalist and comrade of John Cage, to name only a few. And I was thinking how all of these are men, and I know that Lynn Heginian, for instance, was also struck, for those of you who know American experimental poetry, but the women seemed not to have given their books to Rosselli when they met her. Rosselli stands as a central protagonist of 20th century arts due precisely to her disintegration of cantons from the margins. Heedless of cultural propriety, the new cantos that result refract the conflicts inherent in the institution of any national poetry, while eliciting that the nation is itself a fundamentally clamorous form. Thank you.
I wanted to ask about that poem where the lines were devoid of spaces, and where she got that idea from, or whether that's something that she invented.
So it seems my theory about this is that she was working with the fused words of futurism. She wouldn't have had possibly direct influence from, and would not have wanted to cite the futurists directly, because as some of you know, they achieved quite a handshake with the fascist regime. But in these years, this poem comes from a collection called Palermo 63. And for those of you who know something about contemporary Italian poetry, it's essentially a group of parodies of a group of male poets who claimed Amelia as part of their ranks, but she was a very fractious person. And she wrote poems basically making fun of them all. And they called themselves the Novissimi. And that was a citation of the dolce stil novismo, the early sonnets influenced by the troubadours. I better not get too complicated here, but she essentially is herself hearkening back to an older era and combining that with the experimentation of the futurists that the Novissimi, the Gruppo 63, was also working with. So she creates this bizarre thing that she sometimes does this where she's working with the most modern, the futurists, and the most antiquated, which would be this tradition of scriptio continua in ancient manuscripts where there were no spaces between words. And she's quite interested in antique music and in texts, for instance, that have no punctuation. She's interested in punctuation as a rhythmic, for its rhythmic and musical capacity, and basically says we don't really have a need for punctuation otherwise. So
she started as a musician.
Yes, I didn't go into everything, but she started as a musician. She played several instruments. She designed new instruments that undid the tempered scale. And she was a musicologist and called herself an ethnomusicologist influenced by Bartók. So this poem, although it's not something that she did and it never became a shtick. She never like came up with a shtick. Since we're in New York, I can say that, and everyone knows what I mean. Because she was just very, very rebellious and just such an individual. So this is the only poem where we see it. But it is her invention, and it's the result of decades of, taking in musical theory and history and trying to find ways to have the reader somatize language in a different way. And I think that when you try to say this, you have to sort of syllabare, in Italian one would say, like to syllabate, to go syllable by syllable in order to figure out what it says. And so it forces this totally different kind of chant, rather than just, kind of rushing through for the meaning. It slows you down and forces you to grapple with the sound of this thing.
Hi. One of the first poems, if not the first poem that was read by an Italian woman, who read that poem?
The one that I played, that's the voice of Amelia Rosselli herself at a broadcast, a radio broadcast.
The granddaughter?
The granddaughter, it's Amelia herself.
Wow.
We have, she was very interested in radio because she was a musician, and she did radio programs actually on American poets. She wrote fantastic critical pieces on people like John Berryman and Charles Olson, for those of you who know this stuff. And she did radio broadcasts, and then she was known for her arresting voice that Bianca Maria Frabotta says seemed to have come from the center of the earth. And for instance, there was a festival at Castel Porziano, which is famous in the history of Italian contemporary poetry for the masses, the people, becoming so fed up with the elitism of poetry that they were becoming really violent, riotous, in fact. And Amelia came to the stage and she started to recite "Hanno fuso l'ordigno di guerra," and everyone just stopped. And they have that. It's hard to find that recording, but we have that recording. Everyone just became totally silent because her voice is unplaceable. Its accent is, the first time I heard it, I was so excited. I found this cassette. I had to go to some crazy place in Rome to find it. Now it's much easier because you can go to Pen Sound Italiana, which I curate on the internet, and you can find these audio files of her reading. And the person that was with me said, "Non è italiana, no." And it's the same exact reaction as when I took Diego Carpitella and Diego Carpitella's field recordings from Southern Italian folk music, and I got a hold of these, which he had done with John Lomax. And my Italian friend said, "Non è italiana, africana." So we see that although Italy has much diversity within itself, the reason why I hover on these concepts about nationality are that there's still so much policing that happens within this place that doesn't come together as a nation very, very comfortably. It's got so much diversity within it, but there's all this boundary drawing, and especially now, unfortunately. So that's why I think it's important to always introduce Amelia's voice, Melina's voice, into an audience like this.
I know more about it with respect to Amelia Rosselli, the younger, the more recent, so to speak. But I'm wondering about the relationship that Amelia Rosselli herself had, or you would say had, with the social movements of the last part of her life. You mentioned Bianca Maria Frabotta, who of course is a poet, but also was extremely involved in Italian feminism. And so how do you think, with Amelia Rosselli, the grandmother, it was quite clear in your wonderful presentation the ways in which the political context reverberated both through her personal life and, well, through her personal life and through her political choices. But you didn't talk very much about what she wrote. And what I'm wondering about is how the political, cultural context reverberates in the work of both of them, and whether there isn't a dialogue between granddaughter and grandmother, in part on these issues of identity and liberty and the slipperiness of nationality and freedom, but also in part on the question of what it is to be a woman and its complexities.
Yeah, it's true that I did not really mention very much what Amelia Rosselli wrote. Amelia Rosselli started to write by chance in 1898 when she published a drama, and she won. She had an award in Torino for the best drama, and it was a very challenging drama because she was talking about a lady who was raped, and she confessed to her fiancé what happened to her, and the fiancé left him, while then another man loved her very much. So it was really like Brecht's the good of Cézanne, and so she was very challenging about women issues. She suffered a lot because then she left her husband, and she wrote dramas and comedies in the Venetian dialects. And she wrote the last drama was Emilione, who was the lover of in Naples of Nelson, and was the last one because then the fascism started, anti-Semitism, but mainly Carlo Rosselli went to Confino, and so she was very much engaged. Busy just to keep the children of her sons, just to go to the islands to meet them, and then she decided to go to exile after the death of her sons. But she was really the more well-known, the more renewed writer for the theater between the end of the 19th century and the beginning, the turn of the century. And but she was totally forgotten after the World War II. And only just a player, a refolo in the Venetian dialect was published, but then she was totally neglected. She was only known as the mother of the two sons who were killed, while in her memories, this book, she said that the sons, Carlo and Neo, were very proud to be the sons of the writer of La Anima, Saul. So it's really a reverse, and the sons read all the comedies, made also corrections, comments, and so on, because first the oldest son of her, Aldo, went, voluntary to World War I, and he was killed. So the two children grown up with the memoir, the fact that you can die for your value, the value you believe in. She was very much engaged in women's movement. And she grounded also, she was a director, editor of some collections of books in Florence, and she was an activist. She was also for the intervention of Italy in World War I, because she was patriotic. And while also Salvemi was for the intervention, but it was a democratic, for a democratic intervention. And they started also, for this reason, Salvemi and Rosselli to have a dialogue which continued also during Exiles. So, of course, she belonged to an elite, intellectual elite, but then she also was very much, also open to all new, movements and, also changing society, so that America, the US, helped her just in understanding, not from an elitistic perspective, but from the perspective of the masses, the issue of democracy, participation, representation. About the second question, yes, I wrote a paper on the two Amelias, because if you read the letters between from Amelia to her friends Lombroso or Lauro Orvieto and so on, and then what is also Paolo Rosselli and Esilio Rosselli, tell me, Amelia was very much worrying about Marion, Carlo's wife, because she was very much, she had a lot of health problems, but also about Melina, because she was quite a rebellion. And so when Melina decided to come back to Italy, she lived with Amelia in Via Giusti, and they found in the archives some poems which Melina wrote for her grandmother, because she was a writer in the family, the grandmother. So they had a really frank dialogue, and Melina trusts very much her grandmother because she felt protected in Florence. And so also is the fact that she decided to stay in Italy, choosing the language of her father, because it was very much complicated. What was the language she had to choose and where she wanted to stay? In the end, in Italy, also because her family was in Italy, also Marion decided then to go back to England, where she died. And but they were very much related. And I apologize if I didn't mention all the works by Amelia, but perhaps we'll organize another speech and we'll talk about that. Thank you.
I will just say very briefly that one of the things that I could go on for a long time, but one of the things that it's clear that Amelia Pincherle transmitted to, usually when you want to distinguish in a library catalog, they have Amelia Rosselli and Amelia Pincherle Rosselli, and that's the only way that you can tell which one is which. Anyway, the nonna, the grandmother, what was I going to say? Oh, transmitted this sense of anti-elitism to her children. She, for instance, Carlo Rosselli didn't go to a classical school, the Ginnasio, but went to a trade school. And she sent Nello to go and be like a carpenter's shop assistant. These were really, that was not what you did as part of the intellectual elite. And Amelia, the younger one, she was a communist, actually, which was not the philosophy of her father, liberal socialism. So that was a kind of break. But she felt that liberal socialism was not the way forward, and she was an avowed communist, even when it was not popular to be a communist. And in fact, her obsession with the CIA was very well founded because of that. So the two women shared this desire to engage the masses, and it's difficult to sum up how complicated that is when one is also kind of a committed avant-garde artist, but it was very much at the forefront of her mind.
May I add something? Because when I said Pincherle Moravia, it's not just, but it's very important to say Moravia because Giacomo, Amelia's father, was orphan, so that was adopted in Venice by his uncle called Moravia. And I say Moravia because, in fact, Alberto Moravia is the son of Carlo, who was the brother of Amelia. I mean, Carlo Pincherle was Amelia's brother. And when Alberto Pincherle started to write his books, he decided not to sign his work as Alberto Pincherle because there was another professor of history, philosophy of religions. So he took the second name of the family, that is Alberto Moravia. But the connections, they were very much complicated because Amelia loved very much Alberto, and when he was, the family didn't care of him. So that Amelia said, you are to be careful because he had a bone leukemia. How you say? Yeah. So they were very much linked, and Alberto wrote also poems for his aunt, and there is a book collecting this early work. But then there was the tragedy, the death of the murder of Carlo and Nello, and Alberto Moravio never sent any letter to Amelia and the widow Maria. And then invented a story saying that he was very much connected to his cousins, and then when he went once to Paris, he took back a letter by Carlo. It's not true. When I was working on archives in Firenze all'Archivio Bonsanti, Cabinetto Viesseux, I went to see the manuscript of the memoir of Alberto Moravia, edited by what was the name? By a Turinese journalist. Okay, what's the name? Okay, I don't remember. In any case, I saw the manuscript typed and then the correction by hand by Moravia, where he invented totally his relation with his cousins. The reality is that he was really very much, was not didn't know nothing. So Amelia over times also say, okay, he understood what's happened, while Maria didn't want any longer to see and to talk to Moravia, because really he was very much, he was not, did not participated in any way to the grief and the pain of Maria and Amelia. So it's a very complicated story. And Amelia in the memory says that he was able, Alberto, to talk about the worst passions of people. And that, was not the way she understood also literature and the way of writing. So it's very interesting but complicated, connection and relationship between Amelia, Maria, and Alberto Moravia. But she lied a lot, about his Carlo and Nello and their death.
I guess it's time for my question now. Thank you both for really illuminating presentations. I wanted to ask one more about the younger Amelia Rosselli. And actually also I have like a little unrelated sort of anecdote. It was very poignant to see the inscribed book from John Ashbery to her. And actually before he died, I asked him about how it happened that in the magazine Art and Literature that he co-edited in the 1960s, that Amelia Rosselli was published there. and how that happened. But actually, he said that he couldn't remember anything about it or how he had met her. So that was sort of a unfortunate forgetfulness on his part.
That is
But
unfortunate. I would love to know.
but I was just wondering, Jen, if you could say something in relation to this idea of exile, about the fact that she continued to write in English well after living, in Italy, and only quite a long time after her move back to Italy did she really sort of commit herself to writing in Italian, and then, as you say, in this defamiliarized Italian. So, what does that say about her kind of remaining a kind of exile even while being in her home country?
Mhm. Well, as Maria just noted, it was Marina. Oh, sorry. Oh gosh, your name was written Maria in various things that I had. I'm sorry. So I it was not obvious that she would go to Italy, as Marina pointed out. In fact, her brother John remained in England, and her other brother Andrea remained in the United States, where I believe he's still in Indiana, but will not return any correspondence. So you can see that their background was as very much in between, in these interstices between their mother's culture and their father's culture. And I have various theories about this. One of them is that she was fascinated by the difference, the rhythmical difference and the expressive differences in the languages. English, which she liked the quickness of it, the directness of it. And then the Italian, the much more analytical and precise Latinisms of Italian would have attracted her for different reasons. So as a musicologist, an ethnomusicologist interested in polyrhythms and other sorts of concepts that were becoming more recognizable as complexities to explore, she was sort of tapping that within her own work. And then there's the fact that she read Joyce, and she loved Joyce. She's asking for like a commentary on Finnegan's Wake in some of her correspondence. She's reading people like Sylvia Plath. She's very interested in the fact that, going back to the women's movement, that the women's movement was much further along in English-speaking countries. And in fact, Marion Cave, her mother, writes in the unpublished correspondence about how she worries about Amelia choosing Italy, a place where women are really confined to the home, despite the efforts of her grandmother, And so English also just offered up more of an emancipatory perspective, and English literature was going in different directions that I think she was ultimately more interested in. She was also writing about Black power and interested in the Black Mountain School. And you can see why Ashbery would have published her. When I found that, I was very excited. I don't think anyone had known that before. They have a lot in common, actually. It's very illuminating to read Ashbery and Rosselli alongside one another. So that's just a partial answer.
Can you say something, add something? That I think that creativity in exile lies precisely in the combination of all languages, that is sounds and meanings, because she really, writes in relation to the experiences that she had. So it's a language which contains all language without borders in relation to sounds and significance. And it's really very powerful because the rhythm, the meaning, the experiences are all together in a borderless language, which is a combination of English, Italian, and French. Because she speaks with R, she has a strong R, like in French, but the cadence is Italian, then the quickness is English, as she said. So it's a border language. And this is also creativity in exile, I think. I don't know if you agree.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Her mother was English.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that you're so worried about women's position. It's not only Italy and father, it's only her mother.
And so many of her letters are written in English to her brother John in England. So it's a very creative English, actually, but it's English that's, it comes quickly because of her mother.
Yeah, because she lived in all three countries.
There's several questions.
Thank you both for your talks. I'm so interested in the scripta continua that she chose to write in, because there's a way in which, as a very sort of ancient technology of inscription, as you mentioned, it requires, to read it, it requires a sort of embodiment and a lot of decisions on the part of the reader in terms of how to make it come alive off the page, in the sense of it really being a script that has to be, you have to choose how to read it, which is actually true of our texts now, although that's, so naturalized that we don't see it, obviously. So there's a way in which the scripta continua seems to me very much related to what we now understand as code. And you also pointed out this in your talk about how that it has this kind of uncanny relationship, both to like the futurists, obviously, but like the futuristic as well as the ancient. And it just struck me as you were talking that it sort of reminded me of what you were saying about the elder Amelia, and your description of the matriarch as being someone who translates values into daily life. And so that movement between sort of concept, value, idea into embodiment. And so I'm just curious, about gender in that, and whether the younger, I'm just curious. So if she's her politics are communist, and she's sort of obsessed with the CIA. I'm just curious about how you see all of this working in terms of, is it related? Is there a sort of like deep politic in it, or is there something like sort of deeply paranoid about it that? I mean, I don't know what I'm trying to ask. I just feel like it's related to gender in some kind of way, and I'm wondering if you have any insights into that.
I think that, for instance, she would have embraced the English language's more neutral, like the neutered quality, where not everything has to be feminized. So, for instance, I didn't have time to go into it, of course, but when you say vissuta in Italia, paese barbaro, vissuta is very different from vissuto. Una donna navigata is totally, the verb to navigate there just goes through these sexist, curlicues. It's like a Mobius strip to explain what it's like to be interpolated into that. So I think that as the daughter of these very powerful, people, and I would include her mother in that, because her mother could also be introduced to this. She was a labor activist, Quaker heritage. There's a big part of her as her mother as well. That's one thing about English and other languages that would have been liberating for her. And I would say that her gender identity is very, I find it to be rather ambiguous in a really refreshing way. And she really kind of, although she was, I would call her a feminist, she rejected some things like the concept of feminine writing. She didn't want to take on that baggage of the feminized body, of the feminized adjective, of, you know, it's a lot of baggage to carry in Italian culture, even more than in Anglophone culture.
I just wanted to thank you both for your presentations and really for your pivotal role, respectively, in the critical reevaluations of both Amelias. And brief questions for Marina is when she asked you about, you know, when you were talking before of what Amelia Rosselli wrote, just in terms of creativity, obviously her output as a writer was mostly these comedies and dramas in Venetian dialect. But I would argue that in her years in the States, though she wasn't publishing books, the correspondence that she kept with so many directions, with so many different styles, is really in itself a literary genre, or really a source of great output of creativity.
Yeah.
If you could comment
mainly, I mean,
after
the rise of fascism, she was mainly, I mean, epistolar writer. She wrote a lot of letters, keeping in contact with people in the diaspora, friends, but also giving sources for books on her sons. She published, edited a lot of books by Carlo, by Nello, and so she put her heart at the service of the memory of her children. I mean, and it's the reason why I wanted just to put back to Italian culture, European, international, audience, also Amelia Rosselli as a public intellectual, and not as a Madre Dolorosa dei Fratelli Rosselli, as she was pictured until few decades ago. And so she needed for justice, I mean, and not just to be as a mother.
With reference to Amelia Pincherle, part of the extraordinary tragedy is that she taught her three sons a certain number of principles, patriotism and liberty, in a Mazzinian framework. And with those ideas, they went to their deaths, all three. Did she ever ruminate on that later? That it was with these ideas that Amelia taught her sons, that Aldo, when he could have avoided being a frontline combat commander, went into World War I and was killed. And with those ideas, Carlo particularly went forth and attracted the animosity of fascism, and then both brothers were tragically killed. Did Amelia ever in later life ruminate on that situation? Secondly, for Amelia Molina, was the death of her father and uncle, the murder of her father and uncle, at the root of her later struggles or not? I interviewed Molina many years ago, and knowing that the interview was going to be basically about her father, she did have difficulty at the very beginning of the interview, but then eased into it, and we had a lovely discussion of her father and her family. She seemed to be close to John, and from your comments too. At any rate, these are two different questions, but I'm curious about them. And again, thank you very much for the talks tonight.
As I mentioned in my speech, the ancestors of Amelia experienced exile in Switzerland, France, and England, so that there was a possibility in life to die for values, for principle, for freedom, for the fight against oppression, like in Venice, and then for the unification of Italy. So the children grown up also with this, with this sense of liberty, freedom, and justice, so that there was an eventuality to be killed. So was Aldo went volunteer to World War First, and the others they know Carlo because there was already 1 or 2 times in Paris the possibility to be killed, and Nello knew that going to France had the possibility also to be killed. So never Amelia go back criticizing the choices of her children. She always supported what they decided. And she was very, also when they were at Confino, when she helped the children, she always she supported the political choices until the end. And I think that it would have been very difficult to say that she did something wrong, because otherwise she would have to admit the death of the children when they grown up with the principles of freedom, justice, and the fight against any form of tyranny and oppression. So I don't found until now any letter saying that she did something wrong in terms of education or about the decision of their children until now. But I have to read other letters, but until now I didn't find anything.
And as to the relationship of her father's assassination to her struggles, you ask an impossible question to answer. She too was, even here at the festival that introduced her work to so many experimental American poets, she was introduced simply as the daughter of Carlo Rosselli. So she too was sort of put into this box of being the daughter of an illustrious political hero. And so I want to resist, I've always resisted the desire to psychologize her work and to focus on her schizophrenia for this reason. At the same time, I think it's very important to note the validity of some of her obsessions. She thought that the CIA was occupying her mind and that she heard voices. This really wasn't that many steps from the potential truth. So, my interest as someone who both writes and translates and is a scholar of poetry is in how these forms transmute personal suffering, which it's clear was critical to her entire life in her collection, small collection of photographs. Among them was the photograph of Carlo and Nello's mangled, bloody bodies in Normandy. So she kept that with her close as part of a small collection of photographs throughout her life. And she had a picture of Carlo at her desk in her mansarda in Via del Corallo. But it's what the poetry does to resynthesize that personal suffering, and it's not just an expression of her dolorousness, because in fact, when she was really ill, she didn't write, she couldn't. But when she was well, she was able to transmute that experience into something that spoke to a much larger experience of world historical trauma.
May I add, I don't want to psychologize Melina, but the relationship between Melina and her mother, Marion, was very, very much problematic, because Marion had always a preference for John, and she wanted also to live alone with John, while Melina and Andrea lived in another place, lived along in Switzerland with the grandmother, or also in the US. So there is also this difficulty in terms of gender, with the mother, and also while she felt very much protected by Amelia, the grandmother. So this is a very complex issue, where also in terms of gender identity, what you said correctly, it's also due to this complicated relationship with the mother, with the killed father. And she was also very much protected by John and the elder brother, who became the man of the family when Marion was very much ill. While Andrea he's an engineer, he lived in Indiana. It's very impressive how he looks like his father, Carlo. But he decided just to break with the family story, and so it's still alive. While Nello's son Aldo died, while the other three sons and son and daughter Alberto, Silvia, and Paola still alive. And so I'm very thankful, because a lot of information and the access to the private archive was thanks to them, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you.